Remagen, Germany. March 7, 1945. Late afternoon, and the light is already going grey over the Rhine. A German engineer captain named Karl Friesenhahn is standing inside a railway tunnel bored into a cliff on the eastern bank of the river. Above him rises the Erpeler Lay, a wall of dark rock. In front of him, stretching back across the water toward the town of Remagen, is the Ludendorff Bridge, a great black lattice of steel that has carried trains across the Rhine since the First World War. Friesenhahn has spent the day doing the one job that matters more than any other. He has wired that bridge to be destroyed. He has done everything a competent engineer is trained to do. The charges are placed. The firing circuit is laid. Only a short time earlier, he blew a preliminary charge to crater the western approach and slow the American tanks, and the blast of it knocked him off his feet and left him stunned on the ground for a quarter of an hour. Now he is back at his post, the Americans are on the far bank, and the moment has come. He takes hold of the key to the electrical firing device, the machine that is supposed to send a current down the wire and turn the center of that bridge into a cloud of smoke and falling steel. He turns it. Nothing happens. He turns it again. Still nothing. The bridge stands there, whole, wet, and enormous, as if it has not even noticed him. So he does the only thing left to do. He calls for a volunteer to run out onto the open span, under fire, and light the emergency fuse by hand. A soldier does exactly that. He sprints out across roughly 90 yards of exposed bridge, with bullets in the air around him, reaches the primer, lights it, and runs back. This time there is a detonation. The bridge lifts. Smoke and timber and dust rise into the air, and for one held breath, every man watching believes it is finished. Then the smoke clears. The Ludendorff Bridge settles back down onto its piers, wounded, sagging on one side, and still standing. Within the hour, American soldiers are running across it. Here is the strange thing about that afternoon, the thing that does not fit. The Germans were not surprised. They knew the Americans were coming. They had the bridge wired for demolition. They had an engineer officer whose entire purpose that week was to drop this bridge into the river, and who, by every later account, did everything within his power to do exactly that. A German military court would soon examine his conduct and formally clear him, finding that he had performed his duty. And yet the bridge did not fall. The one bridge across the Rhine that Germany most needed to destroy was the one bridge Germany could not manage to destroy, on the single afternoon it counted. This is not a story about a lucky shot or one broken wire, although a broken wire is part of it, because the failure did not stop on March 7th. Over the next 10 days, the German military threw at this one bridge a collection of weapons so extreme, so advanced, and so desperate that nothing else in the entire war quite resembles it. They sent artillery by the hundreds of guns. They sent jet bombers, among the first ever flown in combat. They sent frogmen swimming down a freezing river with explosives strapped to their bodies. They floated mines on the current. They fired the largest rocket weapon on Earth. They rolled up a siege mortar so enormous that its shells weighed more than a small car. All of it aimed at one bridge. And for 10 days, none of it worked. So the question is not simply why one demolition charge failed on one afternoon. The question is deeper and stranger than that. Why could the German war machine, which had spent more than 5 years demonstrating a terrifying talent for destruction, not destroy a single damaged railway bridge that its enemy was openly standing on? And why did that failure to blow up one bridge end up advancing the Western Allies across the Rhine, by the most common estimate, roughly 3 weeks ahead of schedule? The answer has almost nothing to do with luck. It has to do with two completely different ideas about how an army should be run. One of those ideas was standing inside that tunnel with Captain Friesenhahn, and it had already lost, before a single American set foot on the bridge. To understand why the failure matters, you first have to understand that the Ludendorff Bridge was never supposed to be easy to destroy, and that the Germans understood exactly how important it was. By the spring of 1945, the Rhine was the last great natural wall protecting the heart of Germany. It is a wide, fast, cold river, and for centuries it had served as a moat against invasion from the west. Every German commander understood that if the Allied armies got across the Rhine in force, the war in the West was effectively over. The German plan was brutally simple: hold the West Bank as long as possible. Then, as the last troops pulled back, blow every single bridge across the river and leave the Americans and the British staring at the water with no way over. And that plan was working. As the Allied armies closed on the Rhine in early March, the Germans blew bridge after bridge. The Great Hohenzollern Bridge at Cologne went into the river on March 6th. Others followed in the days around it. By the time the fighting reached Remagen, only a handful of Rhine bridges were still standing, and the German command fully intended to drop those too, on schedule, at the last safe moment. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was simply one more crossing on a long list of crossings to be destroyed. Nobody on either side thought of it as special. In fact, of all the places along the river where an army might try to force a crossing, Remagen was one of the worst. On the far side, the ground rose sharply into that cliff, the Erpel Allee, and beyond it lay a tangle of steep, wooded hills with a poor road network, terrain that offered an attacker very little room to break out. If you had asked an American planner in February where he expected to cross the Rhine, he would not have pointed at Remagen. The bridge itself was a serious piece of engineering, and its history is worth knowing, because it explains part of what happened. It had been built during the First World War, finished around 1919, and it had actually been designed by a German engineer with military movement in mind, to rush troops and supplies toward the Western Front. Part of the labor that raised it came from Russian prisoners of war. It was named after General Erich Ludendorff, one of the dominant German commanders of that earlier war. It carried 2 railway tracks across roughly 1,000 feet of steel spanning the Rhine, and one of those tracks had been planked over so that vehicles and men on foot could use it as well. On the eastern bank, the tracks ran straight into the tunnel through the cliff, the same tunnel where Friesenhahn now stood. Stone towers stood in pairs at each end of the bridge, like the gatehouses of a medieval castle, and those towers had firing slits, because the structure had been built to be defended. And critically, the bridge had been designed with its own destruction in mind from the very beginning. There were chambers built into the piers specifically to hold demolition charges, so that the German army could drop the bridge in a hurry if an enemy ever came from the west. This was standard German practice. A bridge like this one was born with the means of its own death built into its bones. But here, the first crack appears in the German position, and it is a crack that opened decades earlier, and not on any battlefield at all. After the First World War, French troops occupied the German Rhineland for years, and the French had grown uneasy about those very demolition chambers. They did not want the Germans to keep a strategic Rhine bridge permanently pre-rigged for destruction, ready to be dropped the moment a future war began. So the French filled the original demolition chambers with concrete. When German engineers came back to Remagen in 1945 to prepare the bridge for destruction in earnest, they discovered that the purpose-built chambers their own predecessors had designed were sealed solid. They could not use them. They were forced to improvise, strapping charges to the outside of the structure, clamped against the girders and the piers, instead of placing them deep inside, where they would have done far more damage. The single best place to destroy the bridge had been quietly sealed shut a generation before, by a foreign army, for reasons that had nothing to do with the crisis now unfolding. That is the first quiet reason the bridge was harder to kill than it should have been. Now, if the story were only about old concrete in the demolition chambers, it would be a curiosity, a footnote. It is not, because the deeper problem was not in the steel of the bridge at all. It was in the chain of command that was supposed to give the order to blow it. And this is where we have to set aside the obvious explanations, the ones that feel satisfying but turn out to be wrong. It is tempting to say the Germans failed because they were beaten and demoralized, just going through the motions at the end of a lost war. But that does not survive contact with the evidence. The men at Remagen tried extremely hard to destroy the bridge. Some of them died trying in the days that followed. The engineer officer was formally judged to have done his duty faithfully. Whatever was wrong here, it was not simple apathy. It is also tempting to say the Americans just overwhelmed the position with sheer numbers, that they arrived in such force that resistance was pointless. That is not true either. The Americans who first reached the bridge were a relatively small task force, a spearhead. When the first men ran across, only around 120 of them held the far bank as darkness fell that first night. A determined German counterattack in those early hours might well have wiped out the entire foothold. The Americans did not win at Remagen by drowning the defenders in men and steel. Something else was going on, and it is tempting, finally, to say the Germans simply had bad luck that a shell happened to sever a firing cable at the worst possible moment. Luck is real, and a cut cable really is part of the story. But focusing only on the cable is like blaming a lost war on a single jammed rifle. The reason that one broken connection proved fatal, the reason there was no quick fix, no second system that worked, no decisive counterstroke in the days that followed, lies in something structural. It lies in how the German army had been taught, by the spring of 1945, to make decisions, or rather, in how it had been taught not to make them. To see it, we have to go back a few months, to an incident that had nothing to do with Remagen and everything to do with why the Remagen charges were too weak and set off too late. In the autumn of 1944, at Cologne, an American bomb happened to strike a German bridge and set off its demolition charges prematurely, dropping the bridge into the river before the Germans meant to lose it. When word of this reached the very top of the German command, it produced not a calm technical review, but a fury. Adolf Hitler had become obsessed with the idea that German bridges were being blown too early, that panicky or cowardly officers were destroying crossings while German troops were still on the wrong side of the river or before the enemy had truly arrived. His response was to clamp down hard. New orders came down through the high command with the force of law. Demolition charges were not to be fully armed until the enemy was almost on top of the bridge, within a defined short distance. The igniters were to be attached only when destruction was, in the language of the order, unavoidable, and the orders to prepare a bridge for demolition, and then to actually blow it, had to be issued in writing, by the specific officer who held tactical responsibility for that stretch of front. Read those rules again, and think about what they do to a man standing at a bridge with an enemy column coming into view. He cannot arm the charges early, because that is now against orders, and blowing a bridge too soon could get him shot for cowardice or sabotage. He cannot blow the bridge on his own judgment in the heat of the moment, because he needs a written order from the responsible commander, and in March of 1945, that responsible commander keeps changing, because the front is collapsing and units are being shuffled from one command to another almost by the hour. The German system had responded to one embarrassing accident by stripping initiative away from the very men who would have to act in the exact split second when initiative was the only thing that could save the situation. They had built a machine that punished acting too fast, at the precise moment when acting fast was everything. This is the true story of the Remagen charges. Captain Friesenhahn, the engineer, had asked for a proper quantity of military explosive to destroy the bridge, something on the order of 600 kilograms of it, the strong, reliable stuff engineers trust for a job this size. What actually arrived, late on the morning of March 7th, only about 2 hours before the Americans appeared, was roughly half that amount, and it was not proper military demolition explosive at all. It was an industrial explosive called Donnerit, a weaker compound of the kind used in mining and quarrying. So he was handed half the quantity he had asked for, of a substance considerably less powerful than what he needed, and told to bring down one of the largest bridges on the Rhine with it. There was neither the time nor the material to do the job properly. That is not bad luck. That is a system starving its own frontline experts of the tools they had specifically requested, out of a fear that had been manufactured at the very top of the state. Now layer on top of that the sheer confusion of command in those final hours, because it is almost difficult to believe. Responsibility for the Remagen sector had been bouncing between different military districts and field commands repeatedly in the days before the attack. The one general who genuinely understood the tangled local arrangement was pulled away to take over a corps on the afternoon of March 6th, less than a day before the crisis broke. In the small hours of March 7th, Another corps commander was suddenly informed that the bridge was now his responsibility. He did not have forces to spare, so he dispatched his own staff officer, his adjutant, a major named Hans Scheller, to go and take command at the bridge. Scheller set off with a small handful of men and a radio. What happened to Major Scheller on that short journey is a portrait in miniature of the entire German collapse. His vehicle became separated from the vehicle carrying the radio. His car ran low on fuel. The chaos on the roads, choked with retreating troops and refugees, forced him onto a long detour. The man sent to take command of what would become the single most important bridge in Germany that day did not reach Remagen until after 11 in the morning, only about 2 hours before American soldiers appeared on the heights above the town. He arrived into a situation he had never seen, to command a scratch collection of troops he did not know, under demolition rules that forbade him from acting decisively, with half the wrong kind of explosive strapped to the girders of the bridge he was supposed to drop. In a real sense, he was defeated before he ever unfolded a map, and within days, this same man would be executed by his own government for the failure that his own government had designed. Consider, too, what Scheller actually had to work with on that bank. The defense of the bridge rested on perhaps 1,000 men, but that number is deceiving, because they were a patchwork with almost nothing holding them together. There were a few dozen convalescent soldiers, men recovering from wounds. There was Friesenhahn's engineer company. There were teenage boys of the Hitler Youth. There were Luftwaffe anti-aircraft gunners who answered to the Air Force chain of command, not the army. There were locally raised Home Guard militia. There were even a number of Eastern European volunteers in German service. These groups reported through different chains, wore different uniforms, and had never fought together as a single force. Command at Remagen was not one hand on one hilt. It was several different hands, each holding a different piece, none of them fully in charge, and the man, notionally in overall command, had arrived that morning without so much as a working radio to call any of them. That is the German side of the equation as the afternoon of March 7th arrives, a bridge that could not be rigged properly because of decades-old concrete, charges that were too weak and too few because of a panic at the top months earlier, a firing rule that stripped initiative from every officer on the ground, a commander who reached his post 2 hours before the enemy with no radio, no time, and a defense stitched together from half a dozen mismatched groups. This is the machine that was supposed to drop the bridge into the Rhine. Now watch the other machine arrive. The American unit approaching Remagen was Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division. Their orders that day did not even mention capturing a bridge across the Rhine. Their assignment was to push to the river and then turn south along the west bank to help clear the area and link up with other forces near the Ahr River. Reaching the Rhine at all was the goal. Nobody up the American chain of command had told them to seize an intact crossing, because nobody up the chain believed an intact crossing would still be there to seize. Every sensible officer expected the Germans to blow the bridges, exactly as they had been blowing them all week. Just before 1 in the afternoon, an American reconnaissance element pushed out of the woods onto a bluff overlooking the town of Remagen, and the men there saw something that stopped them where they stood. The Ludendorff Bridge was still up, whole, intact, spanning the Rhine right in front of them, with German traffic and troops still moving across it toward the eastern bank. The decision that followed is the whole story compressed into a few minutes. Word went up quickly to the commander of Combat Command B, Brigadier General William Hoge. Hoge was told the bridge was still standing, and he faced a genuine choice, with real danger on both sides of it. His written orders pointed him south, toward the Ahr, not east across the river. Going for the bridge meant setting aside the spirit of those orders. It meant committing his men to a wild, improvised grab at a crossing that might well be blown to pieces beneath their feet the instant they stepped onto it, killing everyone on the span in a single blast. It was a serious risk, with a real chance of disaster, and he had no authorization from above to take it. Hoge looked at that standing bridge and decided to take it anyway, on his own judgment. Right then, it is worth pausing on who William Hoge was, because it was not an accident that this particular man made this particular call. Hogue was a West Point graduate and, by training, an engineer. In the First World War, he had won the Distinguished Service Cross for personally reconnoitering and helping build a pontoon bridge across a river under fire. Between the wars, he had directed the building of the Alaska Highway, one of the great engineering feats of the era. On D-Day, he had commanded engineer troops on Omaha Beach. During the Battle of the Bulge, only weeks before Remagen, he had helped hold the crucial road center of St. Vith against the German offensive. This was a man who understood bridges in his bones, who had built them and crossed them under fire, and who had spent his career being handed hard problems and expected to solve them without waiting to be told how. When he saw an intact bridge over the Rhine, he did not see a deviation from his orders. He saw the prize of the entire campaign in the West, sitting there for the taking. And notice what he did not do, because it is the exact opposite of everything happening on the German side of the river. Hogue did not radio higher headquarters and ask for written permission. He did not wait for a superior officer to arrive and sign an order authorizing a Rhine crossing. He did not convene anyone. He saw an opportunity that would exist for only a few minutes, and he seized it on his own authority, accepting that if it went wrong, the responsibility would be his, and the blame would fall on him. The task force closest to the bridge was led by Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engerman, built around a tank battalion and an armored infantry battalion, and the men chosen to actually go onto the bridge and cross were an infantry company led by a young officer named Karl Timmerman, a second lieutenant who had taken command of that company only the day before, after its previous commander was wounded. There is a sharp irony folded into Karl Timmerman, and it is entirely true. He had been born in Germany, in Frankfurt, in 1922. His father was an American soldier who had been serving in the United States occupation forces in Germany after the First World War, and who had married a German woman. The family eventually made its way back to the United States and settled in the small town of West Point, Nebraska. So the young American lieutenant, now being asked to lead the first assault across the Rhine into the German heartland, had himself been born on German soil. A boy born in Germany was about to lead the charge that would crack Germany open. The advance into the town of Remagen was covered by tanks, including a few examples of a brand new American heavy tank, the Pershing, which had only just arrived in Europe and had seen almost no combat. Remagen would be one of its earliest actions. The approach was screened with smoke. The Americans had learned from a captured German that the bridge was set to be demolished around 4 in the afternoon, so they were racing against a clock they could not see. Then came the moment we began with. The failed electrical charge in the tunnel, the soldier running out to light the backup fuse by hand, the detonation that lifted the bridge and then let it fall back, damaged but unbroken, still spanning the river. There is a name attached to that soldier who lit the fuse, and it is worth saying plainly, along with an honest caution. Most accounts identify him as a German corporal named Anton Faust, though some tellings, including one of the earliest detailed histories, describe him instead as a sergeant. Whatever his exact rank, a real German soldier did run out under fire, light that emergency primer by hand when the electrical system failed, and make it back alive. His individual courage was not the problem. The problem was everything behind him, the weak explosive and the severed cable and the whole strangled chain of command. He did his part. The system had already failed him. When the smoke cleared and the bridge was still there, Lieutenant Timmerman gave the order to cross. And here the American pattern repeats again, at the smallest possible scale, at the level of individual men. It was not a general who first set foot on the far bank of the Rhine. A sergeant named Alexander Drabik, a former butcher from the town of Holland, Ohio, ran out ahead of everyone. He sprinted the length of the bridge, zigzagging as he went, so the German gunners could not draw a bead on him, and at some point in that dash, he lost his helmet, but he did not stop. Alexander Drabik became the first Allied soldier to reach the eastern bank of the Rhine. Timmerman became the first officer across, just behind him. Other soldiers stormed the stone towers and cleared out the German machine gunners firing from the slits. Later, Drabik described it in the plainest possible words. He said they ran down the middle of the bridge, shouting as they went, and that he kept moving because he knew that as long as he kept moving, they could not hit him, and that not one of his men was hit, and that they took cover in some craters on the far side and simply waited for the others to come across. While the infantry cleared the far bank, American combat engineers went to work on the bridge itself under fire. A lieutenant named Hugh Mott, together with 2 sergeants, Eugene Dorland and John Reynolds, moved out onto the span, cutting every demolition wire they could find and hurling explosive charges over the side into the river before anyone could try to fire them again. They found unexploded charges still in place and threw them into the water. They discovered that a steel conduit protecting the main firing cable had been cut, most likely by a shell fragment or tank fire, which is the physical reason the electrical circuit had gone dead when Friesenhahn turned the key. And once again, the men solving that problem in the middle of a firefight were a lieutenant and 2 sergeants, acting on their own initiative, cutting wires and throwing charges into the Rhine without stopping to ask anyone for permission. All 3 would receive the Distinguished Service Cross for what they did on that bridge. By the time darkness fell, the Americans held a small, fragile foothold on the eastern bank of the Rhine, the first crossing of that river by an invading army since the days of Napoleon, more than a century before. Now the decision climbed the chain of command, and the American system revealed the rest of its character, the part above the level of one bold general. When word reached higher headquarters that Combat Command B had grabbed an intact bridge across the Rhine, the reaction was not caution or hand-wringing about whether it fit the master plan. And it genuinely did not fit the plan. The great, deliberate, carefully staged crossing of the Rhine was supposed to happen weeks later and far to the north, under British Field Marshal Montgomery, in a massive set-piece operation with thousands of guns and airborne troops. A bridge suddenly captured at Remagen, in that awful broken terrain that was so poor for a breakout, did not fit that design at all. When a senior planning officer at the Supreme Headquarters objected that the Remagen crossing simply did not fit in with the plan, the American ground commander, General Omar Bradley, pushed back hard. By his own later account, he shot back with something close to, "What do you want us to do? Pull back and blow the bridge up." His point was blunt and correct. A bridge across the Rhine was a priceless thing to have, no matter where along the river it happened to appear. And the Supreme Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower, when the news reached him by telephone that evening, did not hesitate at all. He told Bradley to get across the river and hold on to that bridgehead, to push several divisions over it immediately, and anything else needed to make certain of the hold. The chance had appeared, so they would take it, and the planners could adjust the plan afterward. Look at the contrast, because the contrast is the entire point of this story. On the German side, an officer could not blow a bridge without a written order from a responsible commander who kept changing and could not even be reached by radio. On the American side, a brigadier general seized a bridge without orders. A brand new company commander led his men across it on his own initiative. A sergeant became the first man over on his own 2 legs. A lieutenant and 2 sergeants disarmed the demolition by hand without being told to, and the Supreme Commander then rewrote his entire campaign in a single phone call to take advantage of what his junior officers had already done on their own. One army had pushed the power to decide, down to the men who could actually see the bridge, and trusted them to use it. The other army had pulled that power up and away from those men, out of fear, and kept it locked at the top where it could not reach the moment in time. But capturing the bridge was only the first act of the drama, because now the German High Command knew the disaster had happened, and now, belatedly, the full weight of the German war machine turned toward that one damaged span at Remagen, determined to drop it into the river before the Americans could pour an army across it. And what follows over the next 10 days is one of the most extraordinary concentrations of firepower ever aimed at a single structure in the history of warfare. First came the reaction at the very top, and it tells you almost everything about the state of the German command in those final months. When Hitler was informed that the bridge had been captured intact, his first impulse was not primarily to ask how the military situation might be repaired. It was to demand to know who was to blame. He dismissed the commander-in-chief in the West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, and replaced him with Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, brought up from the fighting in Italy. Kesselring himself would later refer to the whole affair as the crime of Remagen and say that it broke the German front along the Rhine. Hermann Göring, the head of the Air Force, admitted afterward that the capture of the bridge had made a long defense of the river impossible. Then Hitler did something that reveals the deepest truth about what his army had become. He convened a special court, a traveling drumhead tribunal, sometimes called the Flying Court-Martial, and sent it into the Western Theatre with orders to judge the officers connected with the loss of the bridge and to execute them. To run it, he summoned a general from the Eastern Front, a hard and reliably fanatical Nazi named Rudolf Hübner, and gave him 2 supporting officers and a small execution detail. None of the men on this court had any legal training whatsoever. Hübner acted in effect as prosecutor and judge at once. The court moved through the officers of Remagen with terrible speed. Major Hans Scheller, the man who had arrived 2 hours before the enemy with no radio, was condemned and shot in the back of the neck. A young officer named Karl-Heinz Peters, whose secret rocket launchers had fallen into American hands, was condemned and shot. 2 more majors, named Herbert Strobel and August Kraft, connected to the engineering and demolition responsibilities, were condemned and shot as well. In all, 4 officers were executed within days of the loss. A 5th, Captain Willy Bratge, the combat commander on the bridge, was condemned to death in his absence and escaped the sentence only because he was already an American prisoner of war, safely beyond Hitler's reach. Only one of the accused officers walked away. Captain Friesenhahn, the engineer, the man who had actually turned the firing key and sent a soldier out to light the fuse by hand and done everything humanly possible to drop the bridge, was tried and cleared, because even this court could not deny that he had genuinely tried to destroy it. Years after the war, Friesenhahn would speak with striking generosity about the Americans who had taken the bridge from him, saying that they deserved their medals and then some, and that in his mind they were among the greatest heroes of the whole war. Stop and consider what a decision like this does to an army. In the middle of the most critical crisis on the entire Western Front, the German leadership took several of its own experienced officers and shot them for a failure that the leadership's own rules had helped to cause. The message that traveled through the German officer corps afterward was not that initiative and calculated risk would be rewarded. The message was the opposite. The message was that failure, even honest failure in an impossible situation, could get you killed by your own side. And the documented result of that message was perverse and self-defeating. In the weeks that followed, German officers along the front began blowing bridges too early, prematurely, sometimes destroying crossings that their own retreating troops still needed, because being too hasty was now clearly far safer for a man's life than being too slow. Terror does not produce good decisions. It produces frightened men, trying above all to avoid personal blame. That is what a great deal of the German command had become by March of 1945, and it is why, even now, with the crisis fully recognized at the highest level, the German response to the bridge would come as a series of powerful but disconnected lunges, rather than one coordinated, decisive blow delivered at the right moment. Watch those lunges, because taken one at a time they are genuinely astonishing, and taken together they still fail. The first weapon, and the one that did the most real harm, was artillery. The Germans gathered well over 100 guns in the country around the bridge, a mixture of medium and heavy howitzers, and they hammered the crossing again and again, day and night. On one occasion, a direct hit on an ammunition truck sitting on the bridge blew a wide hole in the decking and closed the span for hours, while American engineers repaired it under continuing fire. The shelling was genuinely dangerous. It inflicted a steady toll of casualties, and it slowly, steadily worsened the damage to a structure that was already wounded from the demolition. But artillery alone, however heavy, could not reliably drop a great steel bridge, and the Americans simply repaired the damage between bombardments while pressing men and vehicles across, and while their engineers built entirely new bridges nearby to take the load. The second weapon was the ground counterattack, and here the German collapse shows itself yet again. Field Marshal Walther Model commanding the army group responsible for the sector, ordered a battle group thrown together from the remnants of several panzer divisions to smash the young bridgehead before it could grow. On paper, panzer divisions sound formidable. In reality, by March of 1945, these formations were shattered husks of their former selves. Several so-called divisions together could barely muster a few dozen working tanks and a fraction of their proper strength in men. They were desperately short of fuel. Their worn-out vehicles broke down on the roads on the way to the fight. The experienced tank commander handed this hopeless task, wanted to gather what little he had and wait, to mass it into one properly coordinated attack that might actually accomplish something. Instead, driven by panic and by relentless pressure from above to do something immediately, the Germans fed their armor into the fight piecemeal, a little at a time, where the Americans defeated it in detail, unit by unit. The one real chance for a massed armored counterstroke, the blow in the earliest hours that might conceivably have crushed the small foothold on the far bank, was lost to fragmentation and haste and empty fuel tanks. The third weapon was the most futuristic thing in the sky over Europe. The German Air Force sent jet aircraft against the bridge, including the Arado 234, the world's first operational jet bomber, in some of the earliest jet bombing missions ever flown in combat. These aircraft came in carrying heavy bombs, streaking over the river far faster than the propeller fighters of the day could easily catch them. Jet fighters pressed into the fighter-bomber role. The Messerschmitt 262 came as well. Over roughly 10 days, the Americans counted several hundred German aircraft attacking the bridge. And here, the American system answered with something it was very, very good at. It assembled around Remagen what became the densest concentration of anti-aircraft guns the United States Army put together anywhere in the entire war. Hundreds upon hundreds of gun barrels ringing the crossing, along with barrage balloons floating over the river, under orders to fire at anything with wings that came near. The jets and the propeller bombers came, and they were torn out of the sky in large numbers. American gunners claimed to have destroyed a large share of all the aircraft that attacked, well over 100 planes. So much metal was going up that the spent rounds falling back to earth caused a couple of hundred injuries among the Americans on the ground, mostly bruises and welts from their own descending fire. And through all of it, not a single bomb, from all those sorties, from the most advanced aircraft on the planet, managed to bring down the bridge. The fourth weapon reads almost like science fiction, and it is entirely real. On Hitler's direct order, the German rocket organization was told to fire V-2 ballistic missiles at the bridge. This deserves to be understood clearly, because of how strange it is. The V-2 was the world's first long-range ballistic missile, a weapon that climbed to the edge of space and came down faster than sound, and it was normally aimed at entire cities, at London and at Antwerp, from hundreds of miles away. Remagen is the only time in the entire war that the V-2 was fired at a tactical battlefield target, and the only time these rockets were ever launched against a target on German soil. 11 of them were fired at the bridge from a launching site in the occupied Netherlands, roughly 125 miles away. But the V-2 was a weapon for destroying something as large as a city district. It had no ability whatsoever to hit something as small and precise as a bridge. The rockets scattered wildly across the landscape. One reportedly came down dozens of miles away in a forest east of Cologne. One struck a building in Remagen being used by American engineers and killed several men. Others fell on the town and the surrounding villages, killing American soldiers and German civilians alike. The German General Staff had actually objected to the whole idea before it happened, pointing out that firing such wildly inaccurate weapons onto German soil would inevitably kill German civilians. It did exactly that, and it did not touch the bridge. The world's first ballistic missile, aimed at one bridge, could not hit it. The fifth weapon came from beneath the surface of the water. Hitler summoned the famous German commando leader Otto Skorzeny, the man celebrated for daring special operations earlier in the war, and ordered him to send frogmen down the Rhine to destroy the bridge with explosives. A small team of combat swimmers was assembled and equipped with early underwater breathing gear of Italian design, but events had already outrun them. By the time they were ready to go into the water, the situation at the bridge had changed completely, and they were redirected instead against the temporary pontoon bridges the Americans had by then thrown across the river. To reach their targets, the swimmers had to enter the Rhine far upstream, because the Americans had pushed the front so far out, and then swim down through water that was only a few degrees above freezing. And here the Americans brought yet another secret technology into play. Positioned along the riverbank were special tanks fitted with enormously powerful searchlights, a closely guarded invention designed to suddenly illuminate a battlefield at night, and Remagen was one of the very few times they were ever used in combat. As the frogmen came down the freezing black river in the dark, these brilliant beams swept the water and caught them in the open. Exposed on the surface, half frozen, with no cover anywhere, the swimmers had no chance at all. Some died of the cold, some were killed, and the rest were captured. The elite underwater commando raid, arranged personally by Germany's most celebrated commando, ended with the swimmers dead in the river or pulled shivering from it into captivity. Alongside all of this, the Germans also floated mines and explosive charges down the current toward the bridge piers, hoping the river itself would carry destruction to the target. American engineers had anticipated exactly this, and had strung heavy log and net booms across the river upstream to catch anything drifting down before it could reach the crossing. The mines were stopped harmlessly in the water short of their target. And finally, in one last gesture of sheer gigantism, the Germans brought up one of the largest artillery weapons ever built, a self-propelled siege mortar of enormous caliber, a monstrous machine originally designed to smash the concrete fortresses of great cities. Its shells weighed well over 2 tons each, but this monster was slow, temperamental, and desperately hard to move, and by the time it arrived in the area and fired its small handful of rounds toward the crossings, the situation had already resolved itself. It missed the bridges, damaged a few houses in the town, and was soon hauled away again with mechanical trouble. Even the single largest gun of its kind on the battlefield could not touch the target. Add it all together, and pause on how genuinely strange the list is. In the span of 10 days, one damaged railway bridge was attacked by massed heavy artillery, by armored counterattacks, by among the first jet bombers ever flown in war, by the world's first ballistic missiles, by elite frogmen with secret breathing equipment, by mines floated down the river, and by one of the largest siege guns ever constructed. It is very likely the strangest and most varied concentration of weaponry ever directed at a single structure anywhere in the history of warfare, and all of it failed. For 10 days the bridge stood, and across it, and across the pontoon and treadway bridges, the Americans rapidly built beside it. An army poured onto the eastern bank of the Rhine. Then, on March 17th, 10 days after its capture, the bridge fell down on its own. It fell not to any single one of these weapons, but to the accumulation of all of them together, and to the original wound most of all. The partial demolition on that first afternoon had badly damaged one side of the structure, breaking a critical load-bearing member in the upstream truss and throwing the whole weight of the bridge onto the other side, which had been holding, overstressed ever since. Then came 10 days of steady punishment, constant heavy traffic pounding across the deck, artillery shells and near misses shaking the frame, the relentless vibration of it all, the weight of engineers and their equipment working to shore it up. The already buckled steel finally gave way. In the middle of the afternoon, with around 200 American engineers working on it, the Ludendorff Bridge suddenly cracked, twisted, sagged, and collapsed into the Rhine. Around 28 American engineers were killed, a great many of them drowned in the fast, cold current, their bodies carried away and never recovered, and dozens more were injured. The exact figure for the wounded varies between the surviving accounts, but the scale of the loss is not in doubt. It was a sudden, violent tragedy for the men on that span, and yet, in the only terms that mattered to the outcome of the war, the collapse of the bridge on March 17th changed nothing at all. This is the final irony of Remagen, and it is worth sitting with. By the time the Ludendorff Bridge finally dropped into the river, it no longer mattered, because the Americans no longer needed it. In the 10 days that it had stood, Army engineers had already thrown pontoon bridges and floating treadway bridges across the Rhine to either side of it. Sturdy tactical crossings carrying the real weight of the traffic. The old railway bridge had in fact been closed for repairs before it fell, because it was too damaged and unstable to trust, while the newer bridges did the actual work. So the Germans finally, in a bitter and useless sense, got their wish. The Ludendorff Bridge did go into the Rhine at last. It simply went in about 10 days too late to accomplish a single thing, because the crossing it had opened could no longer be closed by anyone. By then, the numbers on the eastern bank had become overwhelming. In those 10 days, the Americans had pushed the equivalent of several divisions across the river, well over 100,000 men, with their tanks and guns and trucks behind them. The bridgehead had been expanded, though carefully and under restriction at first, because the Supreme Command still intended the main breakout to come from Montgomery's great planned crossing far to the north, which duly took place on the 23rd and 24th of March in a colossal set-piece assault with a massive airborne landing beyond it. But when the breakout from the Remagen bridgehead finally came in the last week of March, the American First Army drove east and then wheeled north, and linked up with other American forces that had crossed in the north. And together they closed an enormous ring around Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr. Inside that ring, an entire German army group was trapped, the very army group that Model had commanded. Something on the order of 300,000 German soldiers, along with a couple of dozen generals, were taken prisoner in that pocket over the following weeks. Field Marshal Model himself, refusing to surrender and refusing to preside over the final humiliation of his command, walked into a forest and shot himself. So we come back to the question we started with. Why could Germany not stop this bridge, and how did that one failure move the entire timetable of the war in the West? The 3 weeks figure that is so often attached to Remagen is best understood as a reasonable approximation, and it is worth being honest about where it comes from. It comes from the gap on the calendar. The Americans had a bridgehead across the Rhine on March 7th. The main, planned, deliberate Allied crossing of the river was not scheduled until around the 23rd and 24th of March, better than 2 weeks later. Remagen handed the Allies a foothold on the far side of Germany's last Great Barrier more than 2 weeks before they had planned to have one, and it did so cheaply, at a place the Germans had believed was secure. The official United States Army history is careful and measured about this. It does not claim that Remagen single-handedly decided the war, and it points out honestly that the terrain there was poor and the bridgehead was deliberately held back at first. But the Chief of Staff at Eisenhower's own headquarters famously called the bridge worth its weight in gold. And even the most cautious historians agree that a sudden, cheap crossing like this one spared a great many American lives compared to the cost of forcing the river later against a fully prepared defense. Eisenhower himself put it simply. With the Rhine crossed on a standing bridge, he said, the traditional barrier into the heart of Germany had been pierced, and the final defeat of the enemy now felt, in his words, just around the corner. But notice carefully what actually did the work here, because it was not the thing the German High Command spent 10 frantic days assuming it was. It was not that the bridge itself was somehow indestructible. We have just watched Germany try to destroy it with everything from jet bombers to ballistic missiles to frogmen, and the bridge was in fact perfectly destructible. It collapsed on its own, from its wounds, 10 days later. The reason Germany could not stop the crossing was never that the target was invulnerable. The reason was that the German system could not act at the one moment when acting would have mattered, and then could not gather its enormous, genuinely fearsome power into a single coordinated blow in time, while the American system could recognize an unplanned opportunity and seize it within minutes, and then pour resources into it faster than the enemy could organize a response. Follow every German failure back to its source, and you arrive at the same route each time. The charges were too weak and set off too late, because a frightened high command had stripped frontline officers of the authority to prepare a demolition on their own judgment. The commander arrived too late with no radio, because the chain of command had become a shifting tangle that no one could keep straight. The great armored counterattack never landed as one blow, because panic and pressure from above forced the tanks into the fight piecemeal, while fuel shortages stranded them on the roads. And after the failure, instead of studying it and learning from it, the leadership shot its own officers, which taught every officer who remained that the safest possible course was to take no risk and accept no responsibility for anything. Every one of these failures traces back not to a shortage of weapons, because the weapons were extraordinary, some of them the most advanced on Earth, but to a way of running an army that had gathered all real decision-making at the very top and burned initiative out of everyone below. Now follow every American success back to its source, and you find the exact mirror image staring back. A general seized a bridge without orders. A company commander, barely a day into his command, led the crossing from the front. A sergeant became the first man over on his own 2 legs. A lieutenant and 2 sergeants disarmed the demolition by hand, in the middle of a firefight, because it needed doing. And the Supreme Command, instead of punishing this whole cascade of unauthorized initiative, ratified it in a telephone call and rushed everything it had toward exploiting it. The Americans did not prevail at Remagen because they possessed some secret weapon the Germans lacked. In raw technology, the Germans arguably had the more spectacular toys, the jets and the rockets and the giant guns. The Americans prevailed because their army had pushed the power to decide, down to the men who could actually see the bridge with their own eyes, and had trusted those men to act on what they saw. That is the real reason a single damaged railway bridge advanced the Allied crossing of the Rhine by close to 3 weeks and helped hasten the end of the war in the West. Germany brought the most extreme and varied collection of weapons imaginable to bear on one target, and could not destroy it in time. The United States brought something far less visible, and in that moment far more powerful. It brought an army in which a lieutenant did not have to wait for a general, and a general did not have to wait for a plan. The bridge was never the thing that truly mattered. It was destructible all along, and in the end, it destroyed itself. What mattered, what proved genuinely decisive on that stretch of river, was the difference between an army that could recognize a fleeting chance and grab it with both hands, and an army so afraid of the man at the top that it could not pull a trigger without a signature on a piece of paper. On the 7th of March 1945, at an ordinary railway bridge on the Rhine, those 2 ways of making war met head-on, and one of them had already lost, before the first soldier ever ran out across the water.